Hey yo, real quick just before we start, two things. Thing number one, this video will involve discussions and pictures of animal death and injury. This is mostly animals injuring other animals, but there will also be some pictures of hunting. Thing number two, one thing I failed to mention in this video, or rather did not feel comfortable speaking as an authority on, is the fact that northeastern forests in the US were not virgin or untouched by man, and the history and creation of state and national parks is riddled with the genocide and forced removal of the native people who lived there to create wilderness as we know it today. It's important to note that native people across the United States impacted their environments. Humans are part of ecosystems. The Northeast, for example, is home to many cultures which engage in lots of different land use practices, some of which include things like food gardening and other forms of agriculture with native plants. These were thoughtful, scientific, and spiritual practices that altered the landscape in ways that settlers were ignorant of, ignored, and then devalued. So I don't touch on it much this video, but if you want to learn more, Dr. Kimmerer has several books on the subject published, as well as lectures available on YouTube, which I would highly recommend. With those two things addressed, we can now move on to the rest of the video. Has this ever happened to you? Animals in video games tend to come in one of two categories. Type A are your passive NPC types. They have a resource that the player wants, but they won't fight back and usually just run from the player if they react at all. Type B are your capital E enemies. They may also have loot the player wants, but they're aggressive and attack the player. Naturally, there is variability, and this Type A, Type B dichotomy is an oversimplification. But broadly speaking, Type A tends to contain most herbivores in games. Things like deer, cows, sheep, whereas Type B tends to be your carnivores, wolves, bears, lions, and so on. But if you've ever lived on or near a farm or near any large herbivore, you probably already know that herbivores are just as capable of being dangerous as carnivores. Herbivores, especially large herbivores, may engage in aggressive behavior depending on external factors. Things like resource guarding, seasonal hormonal shifts, presence of young or mates, even illness and disease can affect their behavior. Now, I would like to specify herbivores in real life are not commonly hyper-aggressive year-round in all circumstances. There are many, often much more desirable alternatives to fighting, like hiding, running, or otherwise becoming unreachable. But think of it like this: if you're prey, you have to be lucky, escaping, bluffing, fighting every time. Your predator only has to be lucky once. So it kind of all comes down to circumstance and ability.
But it's a lucky thing I had my pieces.
Your pieces?
My guns.
Oh.
Anyway, I started blasting. Bang!
Wow.
Bang! No, I don't see so good, so I missed. Then they ran away. I ran after them.
Okay.
Bang! Try to shoot them in the back. But I don't run so good either. Anyway.
Anyone who has gone hunting or wildlife viewing before will know the perplexing disappointment of something like a turkey or a deer deciding for some reason the vibes are off and running for the hills before you might have even realized that they were there. So it probably doesn't come as a surprise to you that being a carnivore is hard. Predation is more often than not a numbers game, with hunts for many different species of predators failing more often than succeeding. And of course, this is the trade-off. Herbivores mostly eat food that doesn't run away from them and is relatively abundant, if difficult to digest and relatively nutrient poor. Meat, meanwhile, is energy-dense and easily digestible. The hard part is catching it. It's also worth remembering that herbivore and carnivore are categories humans place other animals into. It's not like a rule they have to follow. There are lots of herbivores that will gladly partake of the nutrients and calorie density of meat. They just aren't evolved to track, hunt, and kill prey, per se.
Jesus Christ! I warned you.
But going back to carnivores, they tend to be pretty selective about their prey. Either A, they primarily go after things that are smaller than them. If your prey is smaller and generally weaker than you, you're less liable to be hurt by it during hunting. Option B is that you eat things that are already dead, either scavenging corpses or bullying other predators off their kills. This isn't completely risk-free, but it is in some ways a lot easier than option C. Option C being that if you are going after prey that is as large or larger than you, you are often going after the very young, old, or sick individuals, and or working cooperatively with other members of your species. Predators live a hard life. Any injury sustained on a hunt is potentially catastrophic when they reduce the possibility of hunting success, and hunting success determines whether or not you will starve to death. So I may chuckle a little when a generic enemy wolf charges directly at my character, no matter how high level they are or what amazing end level gear they're wearing. So I could continue to talk about how most animals in video games are completely unrealistic, but I am also a hashtag gamer and understand that the function of animals in these games serve a very specific game design purpose, something not necessarily served by having an animal act realistically. And that's fine. Game design is made in such a way for specific reasons typically. However, as someone with a background in wildlife biology and ecology, one of the things that we learned was that it is not solely the biology of the organisms involved that dictates conservation outcomes. Predators, but specifically large carnivores, exist in a strange paradigm in the current era. There are many who love and appreciate the large, majestic, and charismatic big cats, bears, and canines around the world, though there is often less fondness for certain other carnivores like hyenas, coyotes, foxes. However, for those on the receiving end of their depredation attempts and the governments and agencies responsible for assisting their people and corporations, the go-to control method for stopping things like livestock deaths and human injuries has been eradication. This is a very thorny issue, and I want to preface everything I'm about to say that I am very sorry to anyone who has ever lost livestock or pets, or, God forbid, someone they loved to a native carnivore. I am very lucky to not have the experience of myself or someone I've known to be attacked or injured by a large carnivore, and I am angry at those who would diminish or demean those who actually live with dangerous wildlife as simply needing to get over it. However, as an ecologist, when you see what the removal of apex predators does to an environment, you will never be able to look at a forest the same way again. My experience is first and foremost in the Northeast, where I shall regale to you the tale of the white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer, known by their scientific name as Otocoiles virginianus, are some of the most common and widespread cervids in the Americas. However, this was not always the case. A combination of clearing land for agriculture and widespread overhunting had led to American settlers nearly wiping out white-tailed deer by the 1850s. But their near disappearance did not go unnoticed, and thankfully early conservation efforts like those under the Lacey Act helped to save white-tailed deer. But hunting regulations were not the only efforts taken on behalf of preserving the white-tailed deer, but we'll get back to that in a second. So, good news, the deer have been saved from extinction. The bad news is that the Northeast was still almost completely deforested by the 1880s, with losses in some areas between 75 and 90%. Shifts away from agriculture allowed for some reforestation, but it was slow going. It was only during the Great Depression, when farmers abandoned their land en masse, did forests begin to regenerate at large scale. And not without changes to the land itself. See, farmers take out rocks and flatten land, since, rocks and hills make it hard to farm. People also harvest certain tree species over others, which changes who gets left behind to propagate the new forest. And then there's the deer. So, what's the problem with the deer? So, first of all, without natural predators, white-tailed deer outcompete other cervids like moose for forage. But the increased foraging pressure from large populations of white-tailed deer don't just negatively affect other ungulates. So, I mentioned before that herbivores have kind of traded abundance for digestibility when it comes to the things they eat, but that doesn't necessarily mean that herbivores just eat any old plant that's on the ground. Herbivores will display a preference for certain plants and certain parts of the plants based on their palatability. All that means essentially is that herbivores are choosing what plants they eat, what parts of the plant they eat, based on how toxic it is to them. So when it comes to white-tailed deer, because there's that higher foraging pressure on certain plants that deer find to be more palatable, they can alter the species composition of forests due to their foraging habits. This is especially hard on a lot of our spring ephemeral plants because their whole strategy is blooming and flowering in the late winter or early spring, where they don't have to compete as much with other plants. But this leaves a narrow growing season for many of them, and they simply cannot recover from the browsing of deer before their growing season is over. Deer can contribute to soil erosion by overbrowsing, and the deer aren't doing it just for the hell of it. They are doing so because there is nothing left for them to eat. There's also the negative impacts on deer themselves, most famously with things like chronic wasting disease. Now, obviously, disease is a normal part of all populations of animals. However, what we are beginning to see with diseases like chronic wasting disease is that because of a lack of predators picking off individuals with illnesses and those animals congregating at higher than normal densities, you are having diseases emerge and then spread throughout a population that might not normally have. Now, eastern coyotes obviously do predate on deer from time to time, but they mostly go after fawns, and they don't have the strong top-down influence on deer that our native apex predator, the eastern gray wolf, once had. You're smart, you probably know why gray wolves were removed from the eastern United States, but for the purposes of the video, I will explain. European settlers already believed wolves to be evil, destructive predators that would wipe out prey if not killed and controlled by humans, and this combined with the fact that as their prey was being wiped out, gray wolves began to target settlers' livestock. So through a combination of loss of habitat, loss of prey, direct persecution, and the fact that as apex predators, wolves don't have adaptations to becoming prey by humans, eventually this led to their near extinction in the lower 48 and the complete extirpation from the Northeast specifically by the 1890s or so. Now, the effects of white-tailed deer and the loss of gray wolves are not the sole reason for the changes to northeastern forests, but there is no debate that a change has been made. Modern forests are more homogeneous, favor early and mid-successional taxa such as red maple and poplar, and are less structured by local climate. Despite more than 150 years of reforestation, these ecosystems are still in the early stages of recovery, in no small part influenced by the fact that everything keeps getting friggin' eaten by deer! Okay, so that was a lot to talk about for an essay ostensibly about video game animals. To resituate ourselves back on the main point, why am I bringing this up? It's because I believe that the demonization and misunderstanding of predators as well as their prey has direct effects on how these animals are treated in real life. It's not just about predators like wolves, it's about nature in general. I have a question for you. Is this a healthy ecosystem? No, really, tell me. How would you know? How would you measure it? How about this? Is this a healthy ecosystem? If I was to hazard a guess without data, I'd say that the first one was healthier than either of the second two. It probably has more species of plants, way more species of insects, probably even some mammals and some birds. It could probably bounce back faster from disturbances like fire. It could slow down or mitigate the effects of invasive non-native species. It would provide more shelter and ecological space to more plants and animals than either of the other two. That is the importance of biodiversity. But the other two are probably the green spaces you interact most with. A mowed lawn is basically a step above a parking lot. They are artificial. And yes, they do have their place. It'd be pretty hard to play a football game in a meadow, but a functional ecosystem, they are not. What does this field look more like to you? Now, this is important because a lot of people will never go somewhere like this, either for distance or physical ability or money or lack of want. So if your exposure to nature is mostly the park you walk past or drive past, the TV you watch, or the games you play, how nature is presented to you influences your understanding of the natural world. I think about this all the time when I see videos of people interacting with large herbivores, expecting docility and putting themselves and sometimes their children in potential danger. And of course, it's not just herbivores. Sharks and bears also come to mind when it comes to people being willfully ignorant of the power and danger of these animals if you come between them and food, or just interact with them inappropriately at all. I recall specifically an instance during summer camp where my kids had caught a frog. This was fine, it was part of the pond-based lesson, however I noticed them petting it, and I had to gently tell them that most animals don't like to be pet, even though they were trying to be comforting. It wasn't that these kids were stupid, but think about it. What animals do you interact with most on a daily basis? Pets. And if you're playing a video game, what most do you want to do to your animal companions? Pet them. Obviously, video games are not going to solve all the world's problems, but I think it's important to think critically about what our media representations of animals can say about how we treat them. Because at the end of the day, it's the animals that are losers of bad interactions with humans. An animal that has become dangerous to people for whatever reason usually ends up getting culled. That's just how it works. So when I see this, my thoughts oftentimes end up wandering back to